Because I'm actually a little bit more nervous today than last time, which surprises me, but it has to do with a couple of things that we're going to get into after those questions, which is very special and shocking but not surprising, but we'll get into that.
When a story is true, it usually holds together. Details may blur with time, but the foundation remains solid. When a story is not true, the cracks begin to show quickly. And in the case of Madeleine McCann, the cracks came in the form of small contradictions, tiny details that may look insignificant at first, but when examined together, they begin to pull the entire narrative apart. Let us begin with one of the most famous inconsistencies of the case, the sighting reported by Jane Tanner. On the night Madeleine disappeared, Jane claimed she saw a man carrying a child across the street near apartment 5A. Her description was clear, at least in her first telling. The figure became known as the Ag Man because she said his head was oval-shaped, bald, like an egg. The image stuck in the minds of the public, a faceless figure carrying away a little girl. But then, something strange happened. Months later, her story shifted. Suddenly, the same figure was described as the Bundle Man, no longer a bald, oval-headed silhouette, but a man carrying what looked like a bundle wrapped in fabric. The change might seem subtle, but in forensic psychology it is a red flag. Memories rarely morph into entirely new shapes without some external pressure. When people are telling the truth, their descriptions may become less detailed over time, not more. But here, the opposite happened. The suspect morphed into someone almost entirely different. This shift alone might be dismissed as the fallibility of memory, especially under stress. Yet, it was not the only inconsistency. Another witness account would raise just as many questions. The Smith family, visiting from Ireland, also reported seeing a man carrying a child that night. Initially, their testimony was cautious. They described a man with a child, yes, but they could not identify who he was. They were careful not to claim more than they knew. For years, their statements sat quietly in the background of the investigation, just another possible lead. But then, years later, after Jerry McCann had appeared countless times in front of cameras, the Smiths came forward with a certainty they had not expressed before. They now insisted the man they had seen looked exactly like Jerry McCann. The timing raised immediate concerns. Human memory does not grow sharper with age. In fact, psychological research shows the opposite. Recollection becomes less reliable over time, especially in cases of fleeting encounters. So how could a vague, uncertain observation suddenly transform into confident identification years after the fact? To some, this looked like the Smiths were influenced by media exposure, their minds unconsciously merging memory with images repeatedly broadcast on television. To others, it was proof that Jerry himself had carried Madeleine that night. Either way, the inconsistency is undeniable. At the moment it mattered most, the witness family had no certainty. Only years later did certainty appear, and that certainty, paradoxically, was the least reliable of all. If those inconsistencies were not enough, the statements of the so-called Topaz 7, the group of friends dining with the McCanns that night, added even more confusion. Their collective story was supposed to be airtight. They had dined together, checked on their children at intervals, and then discovered Madeleine missing. But when police compared their statements side by side, the neat facade quickly collapsed. The first problem was timing. Each friend gave a slightly different version of who checked the children, and at what time. Some claimed they saw Jerry entering the apartment. Others claimed they saw him return almost immediately. The minutes shifted like sand, refusing to settle into a fixed timeline. In cases like this, timing is everything. Children do not simply vanish into thin air. Pinpointing the last moment someone saw Madeleine alive is critical. But the group could not provide a coherent answer. Then there was the matter of the doors. Some witnesses claimed the patio doors were used to enter and exit the apartment. Others said the front door was locked and unlocked multiple times. Kate claimed she found a bedroom door in a position that did not match what others had said earlier. These are not small differences. They go to the heart of whether an intruder could have entered undetected, or whether the apartment was ever truly secure. When friends tell the same story too perfectly, investigators become suspicious of collusion. When friends tell inconsistent stories, investigators suspect deception. In this case, the Tapas 7 seemed trapped in the middle, sometimes too rehearsed, sometimes too contradictory. And either possibility led to the same conclusion. Their words could not be trusted at face value. But the inconsistencies did not stop there. Even the nanny responsible for supervising the children gave conflicting statements. At one point, she said she had overheard Madleen crying and being distressed, an incident that should have raised alarm. Later, her testimony softened, reframed, almost as if the memory had been reshaped to fit a less alarming narrative. The crying incident became one of those slippery details present at one moment, absent the next, eroding confidence in the official account. To an outside observer, each of these contradictions might look like minor flaws. After all, people misremember things all the time. But when pieced together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The inconsistencies always seem to appear at crucial junctures: the identity of a suspicious man, the timeline of checks, the locks on the doors, the memory of a child crying. These are not details at the margins. They are the core pillars of the case, and every single one of them contains cracks. What does this mean? In the psychology of deception, lies are rarely exposed by grand revelations. They collapse under the weight of their own inconsistencies. When a lie is small, a person may keep it straight for a while. But when a lie is large and involves many people, it becomes nearly impossible to hold all the pieces together. Someone forgets a time, someone changes a description, someone reframes a memory. The details begin to fight each other, and eventually, those details reveal the lie. That is what we see here. Jane Tanner's morphing suspect, the Smiths' delayed certainty, the Tapas 7 stumbling over times and doors, the nanny softening her account of a child crying. Each by itself could be explained away. Together, they form a mosaic of doubt, a portrait not of truth, but of contradiction. The official narrative insists that Madleen was taken by a stranger in the night. But the details do not align. They never have. And as time goes on, they align even less. If the truth were simple, the story would not fracture under scrutiny. But fracture it does, again and again. These are the fissures where the truth tries to leak out, despite all attempts to cover it. And it is in these fissures that investigators and the public must search. For the truth of what happened to Madeleine McCann will not be found in the polished statements or the staged press conferences. It will be found in the contradictions, the slips, the places where one person's words cannot reconcile with another's. That is where lies reveal themselves. And in this case, the lies may be louder than the truth. In every great mystery, there are symbols that refuse to fade. In the case of Madeleine McCann, one of the most enduring images is not of the resort, the tapas bar, or the apartment where she was last seen. It is of a hill, an ordinary, rocky rise outside Praia da Luz that became, for some, the centerpiece of a hidden truth. The hill theory, as it came to be known, was built on a peculiar foundation, a dream. Kate McCann, in her book and later interviews, described what she called the turning point dream. In it, she envisioned Madleen lying still on a large, flat slab of gray stone. It was a haunting image, the kind that pierces the boundary between grief and guilt, between imagination and revelation. Dreams, of course, are slippery things. Psychologists will tell you they are the mind's attempt to process trauma. But to others, especially those who doubted the official narrative, the dream sounded uncomfortably specific. Why a stone slab? Why an image so tied to the terrain around Praia da Luz? Bert Stellander seized upon this. For him, the dream was not the invention of a distressed mind, but a leak from the subconscious. A coded admission that Madeleen's body had, at some point, rested upon stone. When Bert investigated the local area, he claimed to have discovered rock formations on a nearby hill that mirrored the imagery of Kate's dream. The large, flat surfaces, the way the stones jutted out like natural tables, seemed to him too close to coincidence. But the dream was only the first thread. The second thread came from Jerry McCann's daily habits. During their stay in Praia da Luz, Jerry was known to go running. To many, this detail was unremarkable, a father maintaining fitness during a holiday. But Bert insisted that Jerry's running routes often led him toward the very hill that matched Kate's dream. The idea, in Bert's telling, was chilling. What if Jerry was not running simply for exercise? What if those runs doubled as reconnaissance opportunities to move, hide, or return to the body of his daughter without drawing suspicion? Bert went further. He claimed to have planted a hidden camera aimed at the hill. According to him, the device captured Jerry, or at least someone closely resembling him, engaging in suspicious activity in the area. This was the smoking gun Bert promised to the public, visual proof tying the McCanns to a burial site. But here is where the hill theory began to crack under its own weight. Bert never released the footage, not 1 second. He spoke of it in interviews, hinted at its contents, but when pressed, he insisted that legal obstacles prevented him from publishing it. Skeptics saw this as a fatal flaw. How can the world believe in evidence it cannot see? Yet, despite the missing footage, the hill theory gripped the imagination of thousands. The imagery was too powerful to dismiss. A grieving mother's dream of stone, a father's runs toward a lonely hill, a researcher claiming he had caught something on tape. It all sounded like the architecture of a revelation waiting to be unveiled, but from a practical standpoint, the hill was one of the worst possible places to hide a body. It was not remote. Tourists walked the paths, local residents knew the terrain. Hiding a body on such exposed ground would be extraordinarily risky, especially for educated parents who would understand that the first days of an investigation are the most intense. If concealment was the goal, logic dictated a less obvious choice: wells, abandoned buildings, even the ocean. Why, then, would anyone select a hill visible from town? Furthermore, critics pointed out that dreams cannot be treated as evidence. They are reflections of stress, grief, or fear, not maps. To construct an entire theory of burial based on a dream, then anchor it with unverified claims of secret footage, was to stretch credibility to its breaking point. Without tangible proof, bones, DNA, or at least the unreleased video, the hill theory remained what it always had been: a story about a story. Still, the divide was clear. Supporters of Bert argued that the symbolism was too consistent to ignore. The stone in Kate's dream, the rock formations on the hill, Jerry's jogs in the same direction, individually weak, perhaps, but collectively compelling. They saw Bert as a man silenced by a system unwilling to confront the uncomfortable. His camera, they believed, had captured the truth, and he had been prevented through injunctions, pressure, or fear from showing it. Detractors, on the other hand, saw a narrative constructed backwards: start with a dream, find a hill that looks similar, then connect routine jogging to sinister intent. It was the classic trap of confirmation bias, seeing what one wants to see, ignoring the absence of verifiable evidence. The truth lies in the tension between these perspectives. The hill theory is simultaneously too vivid to forget and too flimsy to prove. It is the kind of detail that polarizes, either the key to the entire mystery, or a distraction pulling focus away from more probable explanations. What is undeniable is the effect it had on public perception. Even without proof, the theory painted a picture. People could visualize Madleen on stone, a parent running through the Portuguese heat toward a hill that held a secret. It is precisely because the imagery is so cinematic, so haunting, that it endures. In a case plagued by ambiguity, the hill theory provided something unforgettable: a scene you could see in your mind. And for many, that was enough. Yet here is the sobering reality. No remains have ever been found on that hill. No forensic evidence has tied the location to the McCanns. No camera footage has surfaced. All that exists are words: Kate's words about a dream, Bert's words about a tape, critics' words about logic. In law, words alone do not convict. In public imagination, words can sometimes be stronger than facts. This is why the hill theory remains one of the most divisive chapters in the saga of Madeleine McCann. It embodies the struggle between narrative and evidence, between the power of symbols and the demands of proof. A haunting dream, a hill of stone, a camera that never speaks. It may be nothing. It may be everything. And so, the story of the hill sits where it always has, in the shadows between belief and skepticism, between imagery and evidence. For some, it is the closest we have come to uncovering the truth. For others, It is simply another mirage in a desert of unanswered questions. When we talk about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, almost every account begins on the night of May 3, 2007. That is the night the alarm was raised, the night Kate cried out that her daughter was gone, the night that international attention snapped to the small resort town of Praia da Luz. But Bert Stellander never accepted that version of events. To him, the truth did not begin on May 3rd at all. It began one day earlier. According to Bert, the critical date is May 2. He believes that Madleen did not vanish on the 3rd, but died the evening before. Everything that followed the checks, the alarms, the stories told by the Tapas 7 was part of a carefully constructed stage play designed to convince the world that the tragedy had struck a day later. It is a radical theory, but like all radical theories, it rests on details that, once seen, are hard to ignore. Central to his argument is a set of handwritten notes, often referred to as the timelines. These notes, produced by members of the Tapas 7, were meant to clarify who went to check on the children and at what time. To the casual reader, they look like nothing more than rough sketches of a confusing night, attempts to bring order to chaos. But to Bert, they were not spontaneous recollections at all. He called them rehearsal sheets. Think about that word, rehearsal. It suggests not memory but preparation, not reaction but performance. In Bert's analysis, the very existence of these multiple timelines indicates that the group was practicing a version of events, smoothing over the rough edges, making sure their stories aligned before speaking to police. The inconsistencies between the draft's different times, different people assigned to the checks were, in his eyes, the telltale marks of a narrative under construction. This raises the question, why would a group of educated adults, many of them doctors, feel the need to create rehearsal sheets unless there was something to hide? If the story was simple that they dined, they checked their children, and then one child was missing, then there should have been no need for coordinated note-taking. Each person could simply state what they did, and the truth would hold. But instead, we see layers of revision, sheets of paper trying to pin down minutes that slip and slide like shadows. Bert argued that this behavior only makes sense if the group was rehearsing a fiction. And the fiction, in his view, was that Madleen was still alive on May 3rd. By pushing her death back one day, the McCanns could create the appearance of a sudden, shocking disappearance. Without that adjustment, the narrative of abduction would collapse immediately. But why May 2? What made that night different from the 3rd? Bert's answer lies in the logic of risk. On May 3rd, the group's plan involved leaving their children alone in the apartments while they dined at the tapas bar, supposedly checking on them at intervals. But even this check system raised doubts. Why would responsible parents choose such a precarious method when the risk of leaving small children unattended was already so high? The answer, Bert believed, is that the check system itself was part of the rehearsal. It was a dramatic device introduced into the story to provide the illusion of vigilance, the illusion that someone could have slipped in between the checks. In other words, the checks were not about safety. They were about storytelling. This interpretation changes the meaning of the entire evening. If the checks were scripted, then the group's frantic movements back and forth lose their innocence. They are no longer parents acting out of responsibility, but actors moving through a play. And what was the play meant to show? That Madleen was alive until the final check, and then suddenly gone. It is the structure of a drama, not the unfolding of truth. From a psychological perspective, this is consistent with what we know about deception. When people set out to create a false narrative, they must rehearse. Unlike truth, which needs no rehearsal, lies require coordination. Everyone involved must remember not only what happened, but what they have agreed to say happened. And when multiple people are involved, the difficulty multiplies. Each must align with the others. Each must keep the timeline straight, or the illusion collapses. Rehearsal becomes essential. This is why the rehearsal sheets are so important to Bert's theory. They represent the visible scaffolding of the deception. The public was never meant to see them. They were supposed to be tools for the group to get their story straight before presenting it outward. The fact that they survived at all is, in Bert's view, one of the great accidents of the case, an unintentional leak of the preparation behind the performance. Critics, of course, have a different view. They argue that the notes were simply the natural product of confusion. The night was chaotic. The parents were distraught, and in the fog of panic, they tried to reconstruct what happened in writing. From this perspective, inconsistencies in the timelines do not prove rehearsal, they prove humanity. People misremember times, especially under stress. The act of writing it down was not rehearsal but desperation. Yet Bert countered with this: if it was confusion, why were the times so clean? Why do the drafts look less like messy notes and more like structured schedules? Why did the group feel the need to assign precise minutes, as if building a clockwork of checks? Real panic produces fragments, not charts. Real memory produces approximations, not rigid intervals. The deeper question here is psychological. If Bert is right, then the Tappa 7 were not merely covering up a moment of neglect. They were constructing an entire parallel reality. And to construct a reality, you must practice it until it feels natural. This is why actors rehearse lines, why witnesses in fabricated alibis practice their stories. Consistency does not come naturally to a lie. It must be drilled. This is what makes the timeline of May 2nd so critical. If Madleen died that night, then the entire sequence of May 3rd collapses into theater. The Tappas dinner, the checks, the alarm, all of it becomes the staging of an event that never truly happened. The tragedy was real, but the timeline was false. For those who accept Bert's theory, this shift in dates is the key that unlocks the mystery. It explains why the group's stories do not align, why the rehearsal sheets exist, why the checks seem illogical. It reframes the entire case not as a sudden abduction, but as a carefully rehearsed cover-up. For those who reject it, it is an overreach. They argue that without forensic evidence to tie Madelein's death to May 2, the theory is speculation piled upon speculation. A dream, some notes, and an interpretation of parental behavior are not enough to rewrite the calendar of a crime. And so, like the Hill theory, the May 2nd timeline theory sits in the gray space between belief and doubt. It is either the master key or another distraction. But what cannot be denied is this: the rehearsal sheets exist. They were written. They bear the marks of coordination. Whether innocent or not, they are artifacts that show us something unusual happened behind the scenes. In a case where every detail is contested, the timeline of May 2nd and the rehearsal sheets remain among the most provocative pieces of evidence. They raise the question that haunts this story more than any other. Was the disappearance of Madeleine McCann a crime of opportunity on May 3rd? Or was it a tragedy concealed on May 2nd, rehearsed and replayed until the world believed? That question, unanswered, continues to divide investigators, journalists, and the public. And it is here, in the fragile space between what is written and what is lived, that the search for truth must continue. When a child vanishes, the first question is always, where did she go? In the case of Madeleine McCann, that question has haunted investigators for nearly 2 decades. If we accept that Madeleine died, whether on May 2nd or May 3rd, then the next question becomes inevitable: where was her body hidden? Bert Stellander offered one of the most detailed theories of concealment. In his reconstruction, Madeleine's body did not remain in one place. It moved, stage by stage, as circumstances shifted and opportunities changed. He called it a chain of concealment. The first link in the chain was the sofa. According to cadaver dogs brought to apartment 5A, the strongest scent of death was detected behind the living room couch. This, Bert believed, was the first place where Madeleine's body rested. It was temporary, crude, and dangerous inside the very apartment from which she was later reported missing. But it was also immediate. If the death was accidental, then the sofa was the closest place to put her before anyone could think clearly. The second link, in Bert's telling, was the brush outside. He believed that once the shock settled, the body was carried into the scrubland near the resort. Concealing her in the undergrowth would have bought time, giving the parents space to prepare the abduction narrative while keeping the apartment itself free of incriminating evidence. The wild vegetation, with its uneven terrain and scattered rocks, could shield a body at least temporarily. The third link in Bert's chain was more chilling. He claimed the body was eventually moved to the local cemetery, hidden inside a stone casket. To him, this explained Kate McCann's dream of Madleen lying on a flat slab of rock. Bert argued that the dream reflected not imagination but memory, perhaps of Kate seeing, or knowing, where her daughter had been placed. A stone casket, heavy and rarely disturbed, would provide an ideal hiding place. For Bert, this was not speculation but deduction. If you want to keep a body safe in a small town, there are few places more reliable than a graveyard already filled with stone tombs. Finally, Bert pointed to the most controversial stage of all: the rental car. The McCanns hired a Renault Scenic weeks after Madelein's disappearance. By then, international attention had softened, and the family was preparing to leave Portugal. Bert suggested that the body was moved once more, placed inside the rental vehicle for disposal. The evidence that fueled this suspicion came from forensic testing. Samples taken from the car showed 15 of 19 DNA markers matching Madleen. It was not a complete profile, but it was close enough to ignite suspicion. The official explanation, contamination from hair or belongings, sounded weak to those convinced of Bert's theory. For them, the car was the final link in the chain. This elaborate sequence: sofa, brush, cemetery, rental car formed the spine of Bert's belief. To his followers, it explained not just where Madleen was hidden, but why the case remained unresolved. A moving body, always one step ahead of investigators, leaves a trail too fractured to follow. But not everyone agreed. Others argued for a simpler explanation. Why imagine a complex chain of concealment when more straightforward possibilities were available from the start? Portugal is filled with wells, ravines, and deep holes in the earth. The ocean itself, vast and merciless, lies only minutes from the resort. It made little sense, they said, that educated professionals under intense pressure would risk moving a body multiple times. Every transfer increased exposure, every shift added danger. If concealment was the goal, then the simplest option would likely have been chosen immediately. This is where Occam's razor comes into play. The principle, named after a medieval philosopher, is straightforward. The simplest explanation is often the correct one. Applying this razor to the McCann case, critics argued that Bert's chain of concealment was too elaborate. Each stage demanded not just opportunity but luck: no witnesses, no accidents, no mistakes. Could parents really move a body from a sofa to the bushes, then to a cemetery, then into a car, all without a single local noticing? Could they really navigate all of that while under police surveillance, while speaking to media, while maintaining the mask of grieving parents? The forensic evidence cuts both ways. Supporters of Bert highlight the DNA in the rental car. 15 of 19 markers is not coincidence, they argue, especially given the presence of cadaver scent in the trunk. Critics counter that 15 of 19 is not conclusive proof, and the risk of contamination: hair, clothing, even shared laundry could account for the results. To this day, no court has accepted those markers as definitive. The ambiguity feeds both sides enough to spark suspicion, never enough to close the case. Psychologically, the debate reflects a particular approach to truth. Bert represents what could be called the maximalist perspective. He builds the most detailed narrative possible, weaving together dreams, forensics, geography, and behavior into a continuous chain. Each individual link may appear weak, yet when combined, they form a story powerful enough to convince. Where others might see scattered fragments, Bert sees a coherent drama that demands belief. Both approaches reveal something profound about the way humans search for answers. We crave detail because detail feels like certainty. A story with stages feels more believable than a story with none. Yet history shows that sometimes the truth is brutally simple. In many child disappearance cases, bodies are found not in elaborate hiding places, but in the most obvious ones: fields, wells, water. Complexity comforts us because it suggests intelligence, design, and meaning. Simplicity frightens us because it suggests chaos, randomness, and futility. So where does this leave us? On one hand, Bert's chain of concealment cannot be disproven. Each stage remains possible. On the other hand, the absence of direct evidence makes it impossible to prove. Meanwhile, the simpler theories, well, ravine, ocean, remain equally unproven, but they carry the sharp edge of Occam's razor. The most haunting part of this debate is that Madleen has never been found. Without her body, every theory is a shadow. Without physical proof, we are left only with narratives: the complex chain or the simple disposal, the cemetery slab or the endless sea. Each narrative says more about the psychology of the teller than about the fate of the child. And yet, these competing visions shape the way the world understands the case. For Bert's supporters, the moving body represents cunning and conspiracy. For his critics, the simpler explanation represents the tragedy of randomness. Between them lies the silence of absence, the one fact that cannot be debated. Until Madleen is found, the question of where she was hidden remains suspended between these two poles: complexity versus simplicity, the chain versus the razor. And in that tension lies both the fascination and the frustration of this case. We want closure, but closure demands a body. Without it, we are left only with theories, each more haunting than the last. When you strip away the noise, the speculation, and the media circus, the most haunting question in the Madeleine McCann case is this: what actually happened to the child? For Bert Stellander, the darkest answer is also the most compelling. He believed the McCanns were not simply negligent parents who lost control of a holiday evening, but professionals who faced the discovery of something far worse: misconduct. In Bert's theory, the death of Madleen was not a random accident, but the result of a truth so damaging that exposure would have destroyed not only their family, but their entire professional and social lives. According to this view, concealment was not about shame or panic, but about survival. If misconduct were revealed, both parents would lose their medical licenses, their freedom, and their reputations. The narrative of abduction, Bert argued, was the only way forward. I urged caution against diving into what I considered sensationalism. For me, the explanation did not require a secret history of misconduct or conspiracy. I believed the case could be explained more simply, through sleep-inducing treatment and accident. In my view, the McCanns may have administered medication to keep their children asleep while they dined. This was not unusual in the culture of medical professionals, where sleep-inducing treatment was often seen as a tool, even a harmless convenience. But in this situation, I believe the sleep-inducing treatment may have gone wrong. A dosage too high, a child already vulnerable, and suddenly the situation spiraled into tragedy. To me, this version carried two clear advantages. It required no elaborate backstory and no unproven claims. It was, in essence, a tragic accident born of poor judgment. And tragically, it aligned with reports that cadaver dogs alerted inside the apartment, and with suspicions raised about sleep-inducing treatment from Portuguese investigators. The tension between these two theories, deliberate cover-up versus sleep-inducing treatment, accident, captures the psychological core of the case. Both point to the same outcome, concealment, yet the motives differ. Bert's theory casts the McCanns as active perpetrators hiding intentional harm, while my version paints them as negligent parents making an unforgivable mistake. This is where psychology deepens the discussion. As doctors, Jerry and Kate McCann lived in a world where medication was seen not as danger, but as solution. Sleep-inducing treatment, in their professional minds, may not have registered as a radical or immoral act. To a layperson, the idea of giving children sleeping aids seems horrifying. To a doctor accustomed to pharmacological intervention, it might feel manageable, even safe. That cultural mindset, the belief that medical substances can control outcomes, may have been their undoing. In the sleep-inducing treatment accident scenario, the line between control and catastrophe is razor thin. A dose calibrated for safety in one child may overwhelm another. An already drowsy child may slip into unconsciousness, even respiratory failure. If that is what happened to Madleen, then her death was not an act of violence but of miscalculation. Still, the result was the same: an unresponsive child, lifeless, and two parents faced with the unthinkable. At that moment, the calculus of their lives would have shifted. Reporting the death honestly would mean admitting that they gave their children. It would mean legal consequences, professional disgrace, and the loss of their other children to state care. To people who had built their identities on stability, respectability, and trust, the thought of exposure would feel like annihilation. In that mindset, concealment may not have felt like choice at all, it may have felt like necessity. This is a psychological aspect that I think Bert and I share, even if we disagree on the cause. Whatever the reason, the parents' fear of exposure, fear of losing careers, freedom, and family would have been overwhelming. And when fear reaches that magnitude, people often take extreme actions they would never otherwise consider. What was once unthinkable, hiding the death of your own child, can transform into what feels like the only possible course. Bert leaned heavily on this psychological spiral. To him, the decision to conceal was not just fear but calculation. If the misconduct theory was correct, then exposure meant criminal charges and prison. But if the abduction narrative could hold, then sympathy might replace suspicion. The world might rally to their side, and instead of condemnation, they could live as victims. He believed this was precisely what happened. The story of a stolen child was not only a shield against the law, but a cloak of global sympathy. My interpretation, however, I argued that adding any suggestion of exploitation into the theory was unnecessary, even harmful, because it distracted from what I believed was the more probable truth. For me, the use of sleep-inducing medication alone explained the facts. The cadaver scent behind the sofa, the hurried construction of timelines, the alleged DNA markers in the rental car, all of it, I said, pointed to a single tragic arc. It was an accident caused by pharmaceuticals meant to keep the children resting, followed by desperate concealment. Why complicate it further? And here again, Occam's razor hovers over the debate. The principle asks us to prefer the simpler explanation when all else is equal. Misconduct plus cover-up requires layers of secrecy and malice. Sleep-inducing treatment plus accident requires only negligence and panic. Which is more likely? Still, both sides agree on one essential point: once concealment begins, it feeds itself. A single lie requires another. A single cover-up expands into an entire performance. This is why the Tapas 7 rehearsed timelines, why the abduction story had to be polished, why every interview was carefully framed. By the time the machine of concealment was in motion, there was no way back. And that, ultimately, may be the most disturbing part of the case. Not simply that Madleen may have died from sleep-inducing treatment or from something darker, but that what followed was a deliberate, sustained effort to erase the truth. Even if the initial act was negligence, the aftermath was deception. And deception corrodes trust as deeply as the crime itself. For the public, this distinction between accident and misconduct shapes how they view the McCanns. If it was sleep-inducing treatment, then they are negligent but not monsters. If it was misconduct, they are predators hiding behind medicine and respectability. The first allows for a sliver of empathy, the second demands condemnation. Which of these frames is correct remains unresolved, but both leave us unsettled. What unites them, however, is the same chilling logic. When reputation, freedom, and identity are at stake, people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect themselves, even against their own children. In that sense, concealment is not simply suspicious behavior, it is the psychology of survival. And so, as we examine this chapter of the case, we are left with two haunting possibilities. Madleen may have died because her parents chose the convenience of sleep-inducing treatment, believing it safe when it was not. Or she may have died because of something darker, a secret of misconduct that could never be admitted. Either way, the result was the same: a choice to hide rather than confess, to stage rather than grieve, to live a lie rather than face the truth. It is this duality that keeps the world's eyes fixed on the case. Accident or misconduct, sleep-inducing treatment or secrecy, the theories divide us, but the unease unites us. For deep down, we know that in either version, a child was lost, and the truth buried alongside her. In the long history of the Madeleine McCann case, few figures outside the family have drawn as much attention or controversy as Bert Stellander. To some, he is the rare voice willing to challenge the official story, a tenacious investigator who refuses to be silenced. To others, he is a cautionary tale, a man who mistook speculation for fact and fell victim to his own obsession. The question lingers: is Bert Stellander a hero, or is he deluded? At the height of his influence, Bert commanded remarkable reach. His first major podcast episode, where he laid out his theory in detail, amassed over 2 million views. For an independent investigator with no institutional backing, those numbers were staggering. He had captured the public imagination, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might even redefine the case. His calm delivery, meticulous notes, and emphasis on contradictions gave audiences the sense that they were listening to someone who had uncovered hidden truths. He became a rallying point for anti-McCann voices across the world. It was not just ordinary viewers who supported him. Established anti-McCann figures such as criminal profiler Pat Brown and activist Isabel McFadden openly praised his work. Pat Brown, known for her unsparing critiques of the McCanns and her background in profiling, saw in Bert a kindred spirit, someone unafraid to say the unsayable. Isabel McFadden, who had spent years campaigning against what she viewed as media whitewashing, celebrated Bert's research as validation of long-held suspicions. Their support provided Bert with credibility among communities already skeptical of the abduction narrative. He was no longer just an independent sleuth. He was, for a time, part of a larger coalition. But the momentum did not last. After the explosive debut, Bert's following projects began to falter. Subsequent podcast episodes saw viewership collapse, falling from millions to mere thousands. The decline was steep and humiliating, and critics pounced. To them, this was proof that Bert's audience had not been sustained by evidence, but by spectacle. His early success was less about substance than about shock value. Once the shock wore off, interest evaporated. Mainstream media, too, turned its back on him. Despite repeated invitations, major outlets refused to attend Bert's press conferences. Journalists who once reported eagerly on any McCann-related development now ignored him entirely. For Bert, this was not coincidence but conspiracy. He claimed that Injunction's legal gag orders were preventing his findings from being shared. He told audiences that he had evidence he could not publish, footage he could not release, because the law itself had bound his hands. To believers, this explanation was compelling. It reinforced the narrative of suppression. The truth was there, but the system was keeping it hidden. To skeptics, however, the Injunction story was yet another sign of Bert's slide into delusion. If he truly possessed evidence powerful enough to expose the McCanns, why had no sympathetic journalist, no whistleblower, no ally among his supporters risked publishing it? The idea of a sweeping injunction silencing every possible outlet seemed far-fetched. To them, Bert's repeated references to unseen evidence became a hallmark of a man trapped in his own narrative, forever promising, never delivering. This is where psychology enters the frame. The narrator must ask, was Bert Stellander a man of principle? Or was he a prisoner of sunk cost fallacy? Sunk cost fallacy is the human tendency to double down on a failing endeavor simply because we have already invested so much into it. The more time, energy, and reputation Bert poured into his theories, the less able he became to let them go. To admit doubt would be to waste years of effort. To acknowledge error would mean losing the identity he had built as the man who challenged the McCanns. And so, even as evidence remained elusive, Bert pressed on. This paradox defines his story. On the one hand, Bert was remarkably consistent. He never abandoned his central claims. He showed determination that some admired as courage. In a landscape where many critics of the McCanns retreated under pressure, Bert stood firm. He absorbed ridicule, censorship, and dwindling viewership, yet refused to change course. That kind of persistence is rare, and it explains why his supporters still call him a hero. On the other hand, consistency is not proof. Refusing to change one's mind can also be stubbornness masquerading as conviction. Bert's refusal to adjust his theories in light of declining evidence risked transforming him from investigator into ideologue. What began as inquiry became dogma, and dogma is a dangerous position for any detective to occupy. This duality, heroic persistence versus self-delusion, runs through every assessment of Bert Stellander. To admirers, he is a man silenced by the powerful, punished for daring to say what others will not. To detractors, he is a man who mistook a dream and a camera rumor for truth, then built an empire of speculation upon them. Both views contain elements of truth, and both reflect the complicated legacy Bert leaves behind. The tragedy, perhaps, is that Bert's work may never be judged on its evidence alone. Because he became a polarizing figure, everything he said is filtered through the lens of either loyalty or disdain. Supporters see courage where critics see delusion. Detractors see obsession where admirers see perseverance. He became not just a man but a symbol, and symbols are rarely judged fairly. What can be said with certainty is that Bert Stellander reshaped the discourse, even if only temporarily. His Hill theory, his emphasis on contradictions, his insistence on unseen evidence, these threads wove themselves into the public imagination. Millions who would never have heard of him were exposed to his work through that first viral podcast. Even as his influence waned, echoes of his theories continued to ripple through online forums, documentaries, and social media debates. And so we return to the question, was he a hero or deluded? The most honest answer is that he was both. He was a man driven by conviction, unwilling to surrender to silence, who tapped into real inconsistencies that deserved attention. But he was also a man who overreached, who clung too tightly to unproven claims, and who became ensnared in the sunk cost fallacy of his own making. In the end, Bert Stellander may not be remembered as the man who solved the Madeleine McCann case, but he will be remembered as the man who dared to keep asking, long after others stopped. Whether that legacy is heroic or misguided depends less on Bert himself and more on how we, the audience, choose to interpret his persistence. Even as Bert Stellander's audience dwindled, even as his critics dismissed him as obsessive or deluded, a striking fact remained. A loyal portion of the public continued to believe him. They cited his Hill theory, his emphasis on contradictions, and his claims of suppressed evidence as though they were gospel. The question is not whether Bert was right or wrong, but why people still find him persuasive. To answer that, we need to explore the psychology of belief. Human beings are storytellers by nature. We do not live by raw data or endless ambiguity. We live by narratives. And Bert, more than almost anyone in the McCann case, understood how to craft a narrative that resonated. Consider the imagery at the heart of his theory. A grieving mother dreams of her child lying on a cold slab of stone. A father jogs to a lonely hill and is secretly filmed by a hidden camera. A stone casket in a cemetery may conceal the truth. These are not dry facts. They are cinematic images, powerful enough to bypass rational doubt and lodge themselves directly in the imagination. In contrast, the official explanations often sound sterile. Police reports filled with insufficient evidence, no conclusion can be drawn, or further investigation required, offer little for the human mind to cling to. Ambiguity may be honest, but it is profoundly unsatisfying. People crave closure. They crave imagery that transforms mystery into meaning. Bert supplied that imagery in abundance. Psychologists call this the narrative bias. When confronted with uncertainty, the brain prefers a coherent story, even if that story is unproven, to a series of disconnected facts. This bias explains why conspiracy theories thrive, why myths endure, and why Bert's audience remained devoted. A dream about a stone slab may not meet the standards of forensic evidence, but it feels like revelation. It feels like a window into hidden truth. And feeling is often more powerful than fact. Another psychological factor is the allure of the mystical detail. People are far more likely to believe a claim that contains a strange or uncanny element than one that is plain and ordinary. A body hidden in a cemetery stone casket sounds hauntingly plausible because it carries the weight of mystery. A child sleep-inducing treatment and lying on a sofa, by contrast, sounds brutally mundane. When given the choice, many people would rather believe in the extraordinary than confront the banality of tragedy. Bert's theories offered precisely those extraordinary details. This dynamic also ties into what sociologists call magical thinking. It is the belief that coincidences or dreams might hold secret significance. Kate McCann's dream of Madleen on the slab became, in Bert's hands, a symbolic clue. To skeptics, it was just the subconscious expressing grief. To believers, it was prophecy. By framing the dream as a turning point, Bert transformed an ordinary psychological event into evidence of hidden reality. For audiences drawn to mystical thinking, this was irresistible. Yet there is a deeper layer. Beyond imagery and mystical details, Bert represented something the public desperately wanted an answer. For nearly 2 decades, the official story has remained stalled. Madleen is gone, no one has been convicted, and every lead collapses into uncertainty. This lack of resolution is intolerable for many people. It produces what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The brain cannot reconcile the scale of the tragedy with the emptiness of the outcome. To relieve that tension, people reach for anyone who dares to offer certainty. Bert dared. He did not equivocate. He declared. Where investigators hedged, Bert insisted. Where officials said, unknown, Bert said, stone casket. That confidence is magnetic, especially in a case defined by fog. Crowds gravitate toward those who sound sure of themselves, because certainty feels like safety. Even if the certainty is misplaced, it quiets the chaos of doubt. This is the paradox of public psychology. Ambiguity breeds authority for those who deny ambiguity. The less clear the truth becomes, the more people look for figures who will speak with clarity. Bert became that figure. His refusal to waver, even in the face of criticism, only amplified his aura of conviction. To his followers, he was not deluded, he was courageous. He was the one man who refused to be silenced, who cut through confusion with bold declarations. The phenomenon is not unique to Bert. Throughout history, uncertain times have produced charismatic figures who thrive by claiming to reveal hidden truths. From prophets to conspiracy theorists, their success is rooted less in evidence than in the psychology of the crowd. When truth is elusive, people will often trade accuracy for certainty. But the psychological pull goes even further. Believing Bert is not just about Madleen, it is about identity. For many of his followers, aligning with him meant standing against the establishment, the media, and the official narrative. It offered a sense of rebellion, of belonging to a community that sees through the lies. This identity reinforcement is powerful. Once someone commits to such a community, belief becomes part of who they are. To abandon Bert would mean abandoning not just a theory but a tribe. And human beings cling fiercely to tribes. Finally, there is the role of hope. As strange as it may sound, even the darkest of Bert's theories carry a hidden promise that the truth can still be found. That somewhere, beneath the stone or inside the casket, lies an answer waiting to be uncovered. For people who cannot bear the thought of Madelein's story ending in endless ambiguity, Bert's narrative offers hope disguised as certainty. It is the hope that the mystery can still be solved, that the silence can still be broken. So why do people still believe Bert Stellander? The answer lies not in his evidence but in our psychology. We are drawn to narrative images. We are seduced by mystical details. We crave closure, fear ambiguity, and long for figures who speak with certainty when everything else feels uncertain. Bert gave his followers not proof, but something nearly as powerful, the feeling of knowing. And in a case defined by not knowing, that feeling is intoxicating. The narrator's insight is this: Bert's enduring appeal says less about his theories and more about us. It reveals our discomfort with silence, our hunger for stories, and our willingness to embrace certainty, even when it is built on fragile ground. Whether Bert is right or wrong may ultimately matter less than what his popularity teaches us about the human mind. 17 years have passed, and the world still asks the same haunting question. Where is Madeleine McCann? Despite the largest search in modern history, despite hundreds of tips, investigations spanning multiple countries, and millions spent on inquiries, no one has ever been prosecuted. No one has ever faced a court of law for her disappearance. And most importantly, no definitive evidence has ever been found. That absence is the essence of this case. Every theory, every suspicion, every accusation, whether directed at strangers, at the parents, or at shadowy networks, rests on a foundation of uncertainty. There is no body, there is no confession, there is no incontrovertible forensic proof. All that remains is possibility, and possibility can take many shapes. Bert Stellander offered one of the most enduring shapes: the hill, the cemetery, the stone symbol. In his vision, Madleen was not carried off by traffickers or spirited into the night. She was hidden close to home, in places of symbolic weight. The hill where Jerry allegedly jogged, the stone casket in a nearby cemetery, the cold slab from Kate's dream, All of these became more than theories. They became images etched into the imagination of the public. For Bert, these were not coincidences. They were clues pointing toward a deliberate act of concealment. I proposed a starkly different narrative. For me, the case required no grand imagery, no symbols, no dreams, no elaborate schemes. I argued that the simplest explanation was the most likely. In my view, the children were given calming medication, whether intentionally to help them sleep or inadvertently in unsafe doses. Something went wrong, an accident that spiraled into tragedy. Faced with the horror of what had happened and the fear of losing their freedom, the parents panicked. A body had to be hidden quickly, and the cover story of abduction was born. The disposal, I suggested, may have been crude and hurried, perhaps a well, a pit, or even the ocean itself. It was not mystical, it was tragic and pragmatic. Two visions, worlds apart. One relies on symbols and mystery, the other on simplicity and psychology. And yet both share the same haunting absence proof. Neither Bert's Hill nor the detective's well has ever yielded physical evidence. Neither theory has been confirmed or disproven. They linger as possibilities, suspended in a void where nothing conclusive can be drawn. This is why the case still grips the world. In most tragedies, evidence eventually answers the questions. A body is discovered, a perpetrator confesses, or forensic traces close the gap. But here, the silence remains unbroken, and silence is unbearable. Human beings are not built for unanswered questions, especially not when they involve a missing child. The void itself becomes the story, a space where imagination and suspicion thrive. As the narrator reflects, it is tempting to ask whether Madleen is on the hill, in the cemetery, or at the bottom of the sea. But the deeper truth is that no one knows. The only certainty is that the truth exists somewhere. It cannot be destroyed. It can be hidden, buried, silenced, or denied, but it does not vanish. As long as the world continues to ask, that truth is waiting to be uncovered. This is the power of open endings. They force us not into closure but into vigilance. Silence is not closure. Silence is only delay. And so the case continues, not as a solved mystery, but as a reminder that even in the absence of evidence, the demand for truth endures. For the families, the investigators, and the millions who still whisper Madelein's name, the question lingers like an open wound. Was it abduction by a stranger? Was it a tragic accident covered in panic? Was she hidden in stone, lost at sea, or swallowed by the earth beneath a hill? Each theory carries weight, each invites belief, and each carries the same flaw: no proof. Yet it is here, in the void, that the audience is asked to reflect. What does it mean to seek answers in a case defined by their absence? Perhaps the point is not only whether Madleen is in a specific location, but whether society can tolerate ambiguity. Perhaps the case reveals less about her fate and more about our need to know, our refusal to accept silence as final. The narrator closes with this reflection: Madleen may be on the hill. She may be in the cemetery. She may be far away, in the depths of the ocean. But one thing is certain: the truth never disappears. It is only waiting for the day it will be unearthed. Until then, we ask, we debate, we argue, and we remember. Because silence is not closure. And so the story does not end. It remains suspended, echoing in the questions of every parent who locks a door at night, in every investigator who reopens a cold case, in every journalist who refuses to stop asking. Madeleine McCann is more than a missing child. She is a reminder that even when evidence is absent, the demand for truth cannot be buried.